meeting. Call this meeting to order. Madam Clerk, please call the roll.
With pleasure, Mayor. Councilmember Rodriguez.
Here.
Councilmember Goethals.
Here.
Councilmember Lee.
Here.
Deputy Mayor Pappen has not yet arrived. And Mayor Bonilla.
Here. Thank you very much. As everybody should know by now, we're very excited to be here in person with options for those who choose not to be in person and yet still participate virtually. There are several ways to participate. For those attending in person, complete a yellow request form, a speaker slip, and hand it to the clerk. If participating remotely, use the raise your hand feature in Zoom and you will be called on at the appropriate time. If calling via telephone, press *9 to raise your hand, and when called upon, press *6 to unmute. These options for public comment will remain available until I close the public comment period for that specific item. We'll begin the first of the two items on tonight's special meeting agenda, which will be a closed session, and then we'll return to open session. So the closed session title is Conference with Legal Counsel, Existing Litigation, Workers' Compensation, and counsel will be conferring with City Attorney Prasanna Rasaya. So we now adjourn to the closed session.
Mr. Mayor, did you want to call for public comment prior to that?
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear you. Oh, I'm sorry. Do we have public comment on the closed session?
I have no speaker slips and no hands raised, so no public comment.
Thank you very much. We'll close the public comment, and then we shall adjourn to the closed session, after which we'll be right back. Excuse me. Thank you. So we have returned from the closed session, and we're now ready to continue with the business of the special meeting. Tonight's study session on the housing element is scheduled to end at 7 p.m. Should it be clear additional time will be needed for council deliberations, we will pause at 6:55 p.m. to decide if this item will continue until after the regular meeting, at which time it could return. So this is the first item, or the actual second item on the agenda, which is draft 2023 through 2031 housing element study session. We will have Eloisa Murillo Garcia, the housing manager, presenting, along, I think, with the help of Mr. Zachary Dahl. Thank you.
Good evening, Honorable Mayor and council members. We're here to discuss the draft housing element. And as the mayor mentioned, I'm Eloisa Murillo Garcia, the housing manager, and I'm joined here tonight by Zach Dahl, our Deputy Director of Community Development. In addition to Zach and myself, we'd like to acknowledge the rest of the housing element team, which includes Manira Sandir, our planning manager, who is joining us tonight via Zoom, as well as Sandra Council, who's our prior housing manager, Julia Klein, and Linda Lee from the planning department, and Nicholas Vu, who's in our housing division. In addition, we have a team of consultants that have been assisting us in the preparation. We have Diana Elrod from Diana Elrod Consulting, who is also joining us here tonight via Zoom. And we'd also like to acknowledge Nicholas Hamilton from Good City Company, Route Policy, and the San Mateo County Planning Collaborative known as 21 Elements. For tonight's agenda, we will begin with our staff presentation, which will provide a brief overview or a brief background on the housing element. We will give an overview on the HCD comment letter and discuss the housing element timeline and next steps, including a summary of the builder's remedy. After that, we will have time for clarifying questions, public comment, and city council discussion and direction. Our meeting objectives for tonight are to receive an overview of HCD's first review of the city's draft housing element, as well as to receive comments from the public. And finally, for council to discuss and provide direction on updating the draft housing element to address the HCD comments. I'll provide a very brief overview of the housing element. The housing element is a required element of the general plan, and unlike the other elements or chapters of the general plan, it requires certification by the State Housing and Community Development Department, known as HCD. We are currently updating our 6th housing element cycle, which is an 8-year planning cycle which runs from 2023 to 2031. As part of this cycle, the regional housing needs allocation for the entire Bay Area is over 441,000 housing units, of which just over 7,000 were allocated to the city of San Mateo. The draft housing element was submitted to HCD on July 1st of this year. For the for HCD's review, HCD had 90 days to review the draft housing element, and they provided a letter to us on September 28th of 2022. This slide just gives you a quick overview of the RHNA. As you can see, it's 7,015 for this city, and it shows the breakdown by the different income levels. Just to recap on the draft housing element timeline, the draft housing element was made available for a 30-day public comment period from April 6th through May 6th. And in May, the City Council was able to review the draft of the housing element. And between the council meeting and July 1st, the housing element was updated, and that draft was submitted to HCD for their review. And as I previously mentioned, HCD provided their first review letter on September 28th of this year. The HCD review letter included 91 different comments, and that letter is included as part of the agenda report as attachment 1. The comments included consideration for comments that HCD received by organizations and individuals, in addition to looking at the statutory requirements. Those 91 comments were, just to make it easier for us to track and for others to review the comments, those were put into an HCD comment matrix, which is attachment 2 of your report. Each comment is numbered and categorized with an applicable housing element section. Within the matrix, you will see, in addition to the comment, there will be another column that has a summary of the current status, the current housing element status in relation to that comment. And finally, the final column has a staff recommendation on how to respond to each individual comment. We wanted to note that addressing some of these comments will require significant changes to various sections of the draft housing element. And some of the specific comments, some of the comments that we received include the site's inventory, constraints analysis, and goals, policies, and programs categories. As I mentioned, we received 91 comments, but there are a few that we wanted to highlight for you. So I'll turn it over to Zach, who will discuss some of the comments in greater detail.
Great. Thank you, Eloisa. There we go. There we go. So as noted, we did receive 91 individual comments, but there are 13 in particular that we wanted to bring to the council's attention, really because these constituted a significant, the comments here, based on what we have in our draft housing element, constitutes a significant amount of additional staff resources to address, whether it's an analysis or additional research, and or requires heightened commitments in what we put in our policies and programs that we want to make sure council is aware of, and to receive your input and direction on if the recommended approach is aligned with where you want to see our housing element go. And there we go. And then this is this next grouping of 6 really is focused on the goals, policies, and programs. And these are really where we're looking, where HCD has noted that they're looking for increased commitment in what goes into our housing element. So the first 2 comments focused on our site's inventory, and really what is being asked here is a significant additional amount of detail that goes into analyzing each of the sites on our inventory, as well as really pushing us on our methodology. Overall, the information that went into developing this was very robust, and staff is confident that with enough detail, this can meet those requirements. But we wanted to highlight this because there's a lot of staff time and resources involved in providing this level of detail. And I think these 2 comments highlight just the much higher bar that's being requested for this housing cycle. So there's not so much as there is policy ramifications. We do note that there is likely going to be a new policy added to fully address these 2 comments, which involves outreach to the property owners that are listed on our inventory. We have heard from many, but we would be looking to increase or make contact with them and engage with them throughout the course of the upcoming housing cycle. These next 3 focus on zoning and land use related issues, whether it's constraints, providing a heightened level of commitment to amending our zoning code with regard to emergency shelters, Also, and this piece is still yet unknown as we have not received this additional letter, the comment letter identified our ADU ordinance as having some elements that are non-compliant. We have yet to see what those specific comments are, but that will likely also need to result in an additional program to amend our ADU ordinance, which is still anticipated in the coming year based on more recent state legislation. So this is not a fully known comment yet because we don't have this follow-up letter that identifies these areas. And then also on this one, this land use controls comment, which will require a significant amount of additional analysis because the level of detail here is very significant. So we wanted to highlight that as staff will take some time to get through this, but it is doable. It just will add a lot of additional information to get through it. For these three comments, which focused on our constraints analysis, similarly, there is a lot of additional analysis that goes into it. And one of the things we do want to highlight is with this request for more information and analysis, it brings with it the potential for additional comments in their second review, which we're not yet aware of. And so that is sometimes the challenge, in that this may lead to further comments and or programs that we don't yet know that HCD is looking for because they're asking for a lot of additional information that we're still pulling together. In this case, they're asking for backup policies with our policy and programs for encouraging missing middle housing, also looking at various constraints that our zoning code or development standards may pose, and heightened levels of commitment in removing or resolving them. And then for comment number 48, which speaks specifically to Measure Y, what we want to do is highlight the effort that is underway and ongoing with how we're engaging the community and discussing Measure Y as part of our general plan update. And so what our approach is to focus on that being part of the general plan update rather than explicitly a program within our housing element. And well, our general plan update and housing element are running concurrently. As you're aware, our general plan update is about a year behind where the housing element is at. So our approach here is really to focus on the work we're doing as part of the general plan update, but not necessarily include additional measures specifically in the housing element. And then moving to our goals, policies, and programs. Going through these, we've got 3 on this slide and 3 on the next. The underlying theme here is really a heightened level of commitment, which can be challenging, and we are looking for some direction from council on these, is that we haven't yet done the study or the analysis to determine what is the best way to address some of these circumstances, whether it's parking, application streamlining, and so it is challenging to commit to something that we don't fully understand the best solution or the best path forward as of yet. And so we do have a recommendation for how to move forward, but we are looking for council input as part of that to ensure we're going in the right direction and not committing to something we ultimately can't deliver on. And then similar with these 3 comments, we are looking for council input and direction on all 3 as to how you want to see us proceed with the level of commitment or additional programs that we add to address these comments. And these speak to our zoning code development standards, missing middle housing, as well as allowing for special need group homes if they are proposed. The other piece that we want to highlight is with this 8-year policy and program, there is a lot of activity that needs to take place once the housing element's adopted. So right here, just to give you a visual comparison, we have, I believe, 45 policies with 67 implementing actions. And so in order to ensure we have the staff resources to support and implement these in the timeline we've allotted, we did spread them out over the course of the 8-year period. Obviously more coming at the front end so that then they can be realized over the back end. But it is very challenging if we do too much front loading because we won't have the staff resources to give them the time that they need to get through each one. So here you can see we have 27 implementation programs that will be happening each and every year. So that's staff time that'll be dedicated to monitoring them on an annual basis. And then you can see moving through 23, 24, 25, each year then we have additional specific policies and programs that staff will need to expend resources on to implement. And there were a number of comments that asked for the city to move programs or policies to the front end of the housing cycle. And one of the things that we're going to need to carefully evaluate is, with programs coming up, we're also going to need to understand what might need to be moved down to ensure that we can come through with this commitment. And then it's not shown on here, but we do want to highlight it, is concurrently with housing element implementation, we are going to be implementing our general plan update. And with a target to have it adopted by the end of 2023, potentially into 24, that means that we're updating our specific plans, we're doing rezonings, and we're doing a lot of other implementation activity that will be very staff intensive in 24, 25, and 26. And so implementation of the housing element is just one piece of the overall general plan that will require a significant amount of staff resources in the coming years. So in terms of next steps, after our study session this evening, the housing element team will be working to update our housing element based on your direction in November and December, and then getting that resubmitted to HCD. And then we are looking at a January for public hearings before the Planning Commission and then ultimately the City Council for adoption, so that we stay on target to submit an adopted housing element to HCD by the end of January 23. As you're probably aware, more recently there was some clarifications provided by the state that really made that January 31 deadline a lot more rigid. There was previous discussions about use of that 120-day grace period to get through the full review, because we do have so many more pieces of legislation as well as requirements that need to go into this housing element. However, at this point, it is our understanding that any housing element that is not in substantial compliance and adopted by the end of January 31, 2023, could be subject to the loss of local zoning control, and development applications could utilize the builder's remedy, which allows them to proceed without local zoning or land use being in effect. One key point to note is local adoption, not HCD certification, is the key step required before this January date. And so that is what the timeline that we're anticipating to align with this accordingly, because we will be concurrently with that adoption under review by the state for our second review. So as noted, our next steps here are really to make those changes to bring our housing element into alignment with HCD's comments. We are seeking input and direction from the council. We have provided a recommendation for how to address each of those 91 comments, so input on any of those recommendations is welcome. And then we did want to highlight those 13 comments where we would appreciate some direct input and direction on how staff should proceed forward with addressing them, in particular the comments related to our goals, policies, and actions. And this basically frames the discussion that we're looking for once we bring it back to council. And so at this point, this does conclude our presentation, and we are available if you have any questions. And as noted, in addition to Eloisa and myself, we also have our housing element consultant, Diana Elrod, and our planning manager, Manira Sandir, attending virtually, as well as our director, Christina Horaceberger.
Thank you very much for the presentation. So, council members, I think it's time for us to see if we have some questions. Councilmember Goethals.
Sure. Can you actually go back to the other page with the
Which slide was that?
the table with one more? Thank you.
Could you get a little closer to the mic, Joe, please?
That's good.
Thanks.
The housing elements every 8 years, right?
Yes.
And so I remember 8 years ago when we were going through this process, it was more of an exercise. The powers that the state agency has over cities is now far greater than they've ever had before. Is that fair?
That would be an accurate assessment.
And remind me, we're doing this because it also helps, or it's in collaboration with the Regional Housing Needs Assessment, where we are looking at where are the jobs and where are people living to get to those jobs, because that causes a tremendous amount of traffic, and making sure that we're building the proper amount of housing where those jobs are. Is that kind of the process that we're going through right now?
There's a component to it, but I wouldn't say that's the sole driver of the housing allocation when it got down to each jurisdiction within the Bay Area region.
What we're looking at this year, though, are, for the first time maybe, there are actual remedies if our housing element isn't passed and if our housing element isn't approved. We're seeing that our local control would be taken away. Is that fair?
Yes, there is definite ramification for our housing element being non-compliant or the city not following through with the commitments outlined in the housing element.
One of the constraints that we're under is Measure Y and heights and things like that. That's a fair assessment of where we stand in trying to address the amount of housing that we have to zone for?
Measure Y can be considered a constraint, but the housing element has identified a path forward to meet our RENA plus a buffer of approximately 50% within this housing cycle with Measure Y in place.
The way that it seems like it's a constraint to me is that if I wanted to actually, before I get to that point, one of the things that we're being encouraged to do is get rid of parking requirements for multifamily housing, right? And we already see serious parking issues with multifamily housing next to single-family housing where those cars go all over the neighborhood. And the solution to that, under the constraints of Measure Y, is to spread out all the new housing all over the city, as opposed to putting heightened density closer to transit where you're not creating that parking problem all over the city. Do you understand what I'm saying about the constraints of Measure Y, meaning that you have to spread the housing across the city as opposed to concentrating it?
Yes, that would be a fair assessment. Because of the density cap within Measure Y, we do need more sites on our inventory in order to meet our RENA, plus provide that buffer. So without that density cap, we could realize higher density closer to transit, which would require fewer sites on the inventory to meet our overall RENA of approximately 7,000 new units.
One of the tools that we had for making sure that we didn't have serious parking issues in parts of in areas where new multifamily housing was going in was that we had these parking requirements that we could impose so that these multifamily new housing complexes were not causing parking problems for the single-family neighborhoods right next door. But we can't do that anymore, right?
For projects that are located within 1/2 mile of transit, there is new state law that now prohibits the city from setting any parking requirements. Beyond that, there is a housing element policy and associated program to evaluate parking standards for multifamily and make adjustments as needed, but we still have the ability to require parking to some degree on projects that are further than 1/2 mile from transit. But there is also state density bonus law, which sets parking standards, which would supersede local standards. So there are already various pieces of state law that limit how much parking the city can require on any residential project.
I appreciate that. I wanted to make sure that I understood those constraints that we're under. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Sure, thank you. Next. Councilmember Rodriguez.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Let me just pull up my. I had a question about a term that you used throughout the presentation. It was the HCD wanted to see a heightened level of commitment. And I'm trying to figure out what exactly that means.
So an example of that where language right now in a program will be explore or evaluate potential barriers to multifamily housing and schedule a council meeting to consider alternatives or way to reduce that. They're now looking for a commitment that says specifically what we will remove from the zoning code to eliminate that constraint. As an example, that's general, not, but it's that type of requirement now where rather than exploring a topic to determine what's the most appropriate path forward with input from the community and ultimate direction from the city council, they're now looking for a commitment on what direction we're going to go in the document before that process has taken place.
So are they looking for this council to kind of bind or influence like future councils and what their ultimate decision is going to be?
Potentially, the housing element that's ultimately adopted, we have a heightened level of obligation to meet what's outlined here. So if we're committing to an outcome and then that doesn't occur, that could be grounds for looking at us being non-compliant with our housing element.
So they're asking us to make all these heightened commitments, and maybe without all the outreach, maybe without all the analysis that we normally do. We're going to be, if we want to get this approved or increase the likelihood of it getting approved, so we're going to just be making these commitments, and then a year from now, a future council with 4 new members is going to be basically have to take those recommendations, or else we risk being out of compliance. Is that, am I understanding that correctly?
Potentially. I think the goal is, and one of the things that we did with a number of our recommendations was look at what is the level. Is it full commitment on a certain outcome, or is it a heightened commitment to doing something to address the outcome? So in some cases, it may not be exact, but it's a heightened level of commitment that something will need to be done as opposed to just exploring. But in some comments, it does seek a relatively specific outcome.
Okay. Is there, you mentioned that in your response to Councilmember Goethals that even if we did take certain actions, we would still have a 50% buffer. Is there a minimum buffer that they require?
Under state statute, no buffer is required, but the guidance is at least 15%. But it varies, and if our housing consultant, Diana Elrod, maybe wants to provide a bit more background on how buffers are applied and if there's, what kind of legal requirements go with that.
Right. Good evening. The issue of buffers is really about, there's not a specific statutory requirement for it, but the idea is that you want to have a sufficient buffer so that if you have identified a site that could be for lower income housing actually gets developed with higher income housing or with non-housing uses, that those units that could potentially be lost from the inventory can be made up elsewhere. And so basically the way that the inventories in every jurisdiction that I've been looking at and working with are showing we're trying to reach a 15% buffer or more for lower income. And that specifically is very low and low because those are the hardest ones to actually make sure there's enough inventory or capacity left in your inventory if development occurs at higher levels of income. So this, we're basically doing is hedging a bet against the no net loss provisions of state law, which says that you cannot, at any given point in your housing element cycle, you cannot essentially lose the full capacity for your lower income by development that's not lower income. So the buffer is at least a hedge against that, the possibility of development occurring that is like above moderate income or commercial development, so that there's always enough capacity for the lower income numbers. And that's also, the law has changed on that in the sense that it used to be, you could look at it, a backwards look at the end of the 8 years and say, oh, we lost units, but it's at every moment in the inventory, every year. We have to make sure that we don't lose capacity for low and very low. If that doesn't answer it, I'd be happy to.
Yeah, no, that answers
Try
my
better.
question. Thank you. And one last question I have is, staff report mentions that, we have to adopt our own findings for our housing element, and that doesn't necessarily need to be certified in order to ward off the builder's remedy. And then the council received a letter from the Housing Leadership Council that said that at least my interpretation was that may be true, but that could open us up to lawsuits. And I was just curious what our city attorney has to say about that comment.
So the housing element law prescribes a process, and that process is the city must submit the housing element to HCD for review, and then ideally HCD will certify the housing element as compliant with the housing element law. If HCD comes back and says, no, your housing element is not compliant, then the process allows the city to make certain findings saying, we disagree, our housing element is compliant with the housing element law, but then we have to explain that. And then in the future, if the housing element gets litigated, whereas if the HCD had certified the housing element as compliant, we would have a rebuttable presumption in court that the housing element was valid. But without that HCD certification, we no longer have that presumption. So it creates a certain level of risk, perhaps. We don't have as much protection, but just having a lack of HCD certification does not in and of itself expose the city to liability. It's more, is the housing element compliant with the housing element law? Is it substantially compliant? That's ultimately the legal standard. But to help guard against that, every city, seeks HCD certification.
And just a follow-up question to that. How would you advise this council to kind of view that risk? Because just a risk is it a lot of risk? Is it a little bit of risk? I mean,
I think the goal is HCD certification, I think, for every city that's looking at this process. And then we'll just have to see what the HCD response is to the next draft of the housing element, and then we can evaluate what, if any, risk exists at that point.
Okay, thank you. Deputy Mayor Pappas.
Just one follow-up question. And what if there's disagreement about the HCD ruling? In other words, they withhold certification and you disagree?
Well, again, if HCD withholds certification, the housing element law prescribes a process for the city to make findings explaining why the city feels that it can adopt this draft housing element that it determines is substantially compliant with the housing element law. So that's the means by which the city could say, we have a housing element that substantially complies with the housing element law, notwithstanding HCD's disagreement. So, and that process, that back and forth is in the statute. But again, the goal is not to be kind of in that position. It's really the city is seeking HCD approval or certification of the housing element.
I guess, let me be more direct. Could the city sue HCD if it feels that certification was improperly withheld because we are justifying that our housing element is in compliance? Or are you suggesting that that only comes up in some sort of other litigation that somebody might file, and then the city says, like, for example, the builder's remedy could not apply here because we believe that our housing element is in compliance with the law?
I think it's more the latter. It's not that the city would necessarily, initiate litigation in that case, because the statute, again, prescribes a process for what to do if the city disagrees with HCD. The risk, a risk, if any, might arise in later litigation that involves a housing element either directly or indirectly.
Okay, got it, thanks.
Thank you. Councilmember Lee.
Hi, Zach. I had just a clarifying question about one of the policies. And the report was very thorough in documenting, for example, like in the, between 2010 and 2020, our housing units increased by 3.6%. In almost the same period, our jobs increased by 33%. So by that metric, it seems that we are overproducing jobs and underproducing housing. And one of the key issues that our community has discussed is the rate of commercial developments and the dire need for affordable housing. And so, I wanted to ask about the affordable housing overlay policies, and specifically, I think that there's room to strengthen the language and have more robust language around a policy that will contemplate affordable housing overlays, and specifically for those religious institutions and schools. I know for a fact there's two religious institutions that I've been in touch with that had wanted to build affordable housing and ran into significant roadblocks because of the constraints of our zoning. And so I see a real opportunity and need to fold that policy into this document and into this goal. And secondly, I really just wanted to better understand the way that we're framing the A and B outcomes. Is that meant to be a yes and or an or? because when I was looking at the one of the policy goals, which was to create a minimum density for residential on mixed-use zoned plots, it had two different possible outcomes. And so I wanted to just get further clarification about that, that specific housing element program or policy.
Was that within the HCD comment matrix? And
It's within the housing element
Oh, the housing
itself.
element. Okay.
And I can try to bring it up. I just had it for a second. Hold on.
In general, when you see A's and B's, they're ands rather than ors, because
Okay.
that would mean we're listing different ways that we are recommending to respond. So it's not an or, but it's saying we would do this and this. And I think specifically to your question about mixed use, what you're seeing is we are highlighting moving forward with a policy to discuss setting minimum densities for mixed-use projects when they have a residential component. And then along with that would be the bigger question, which there is more ramification to it, requiring any mixed-use project to have residential. So I think there's a bigger discussion that goes with that one. I think there's been a lot of discussion and there's a lot of logic to setting a minimum density for a project with a residential component, because they can now utilize density bonus and the concessions and waivers that go with it. So if they're going to realize those benefits, we want to make sure that there's a sufficient number of units to justify the benefits they're getting, as opposed to proposing a few minor units and then realizing meaningful benefits. So that was the first part, and then the second part, I think, would be the bigger question of, is there interest in requiring every mixed-use project to have a residential component?
And so because it's included as A and B, both are contemplated and up for discussion.
Yeah, the intent would be that that discussion happens together. If we're going to discuss that, both of those questions should come forward for discussion and community input.
Okay, well, I mean, so this is something that we've talked about a lot before, and I feel very strongly about making sure that, where we have mixed-use zoned land, which is a significant portion of the study areas, that we are maximizing all of the residential potential there. And as we know, the market favors commercial development. And so if we rely on market forces alone, then we will not get the residential development that I think that this community really needs. And I did notice in the land use element under policy 1.3, the mixed use section said encourage mixed use development to include a residential component, provide greater proximity between jobs and housing, promote pedestrian activities, and had some slight modifications. But again, it was referring to an encourage and didn't mention the possibility of requiring, which is something that I think should be on the table and I hope we will be discussing. And so where there's, where there may be sort of gaps in terms of how we're reflecting the way we treat mixed use, or what is being considered as a policy goal or objective, I just would like to emphasize the need to be consistent across all of the elements. And then I think, I would just like to better understand, in addition to outreach to the property owners, what steps are we taking to analyze the probability of development for the inventory list? I think that there's a lot of questions about the methodology, and so I think it would be really helpful for us and the community to have a clear understanding about what metrics we're using or criteria we're using to rank these designated sites, and what, just have that be much more clear for us as a council and a community.
Okay, did you want me to go into some detail about how we evaluated right now?
I think my understanding is that there was a rank system, 1 through 5, kind of designating the site inventory as likely to get redeveloped or not. It would be helpful for me to better understand what was that ranking criteria based on, and then what is planned moving forward to better analyze the feasibility of our inventory list.
Well, I think the goal is that the analysis that goes in establishes the capacity and then also a higher degree of likelihood that these sites would redevelop over the 8 years. The city cannot compel any property owner to move forward with development. What we have to do is make sure that we have the regulations and policies in place that would incentivize a property owner to move forward. And then the sites that went onto our list are sites that seem like the most likely candidates: underutilization, older buildings, other factors that might motivate a property owner to develop. But if I could ask our housing consultant, Diana Elrod, maybe if maybe we could elaborate on the scoring system that went into the sites that we identified on our sites inventory.
Right. There was a pretty detailed discussion in the methodology section of the housing element that explained how we rated and ranked each of the sites that we looked at. And at the number 1 level, the highest level, were those sites that actually had a project proposed on them. And the ones at the bottom were at 5, least likely to be developed, were those that had such substantial, for example, environmental constraints, or there were things that the state had told us would be really difficult to prove. For example, with some exceptions, chain restaurants, chain grocery stores, chain gas stations. Those are the kinds of things that they really recommended us not to include. Mom and pop grocery stores, mom and pop gas stations, depending upon our understanding of whether or not, for example, let's say with a gas station, whether or not mitigation had taken place to address underground tanks, et cetera. Those kinds of things kind of factored into whether or not they received a higher or lower score. Projects that had developer interest were obviously those that would have a higher score. And the whole time we were thinking, even if a developer is interested in it, how many different factors would be involved in determining whether or not it could be actually developed in the 8 years of the housing element cycle? And we laid that out pretty extensively in the methodology section to explain things like how long it would take to do site consolidation, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, I don't have that information totally on the top of my head, but I think we'll be happy to share that information that we can provide in the methodology section.
Thank you. Those are my questions.
Okay. Thank you. Yeah, go ahead.
I'm sorry, Mr. Mayor.
I just want to mention it's 6:30. Thanks.
What is our jobs housing balance? I thought it was like 1-to-1, our jobs housing balance.
Yes, our jobs housing balance is 1.05 to 1.
Okay, all right. I just want to be clear about that. I would not be adverse to looking at densities, housing densities as it relates to mixed use either. So if we want to get a little more specific there, I would join that choir. But I just wanted to be clear, when we say we're adding all these jobs, I understood our balance to be what you had said, the 1.05 to 1. Okay.
Thanks. I have a couple of questions. First, I did review the letter that came from Housing Leadership Council today. And in it, they're quoting in their third paragraph what I noticed right away when I was looking at the matrix, which was the part where it says, it should be noted that HCD certification is not required for a housing element to be found substantially compliant with state law, and you know the rest of it. How sure are we of that? Because I hear of other cities in Southern California where all this has already come to pass and they're suffering draconian penalties. So, and I want to mention also, you know, that there was the mention of possible lawsuits, and we've already lived through that. We have not done well. I want to make sure we're doing everything we can to avoid that. Can you explain how we're doing that too?
I'll start, and then I'll see if Prasanna wants to follow up on my response. I don't think we can be 100% sure on anything given the changing nature of statutory requirements around housing, especially for this housing cycle. So what we're doing is moving forward under the best information and knowledge that we have at this moment. But I don't think we can be 100% sure.
Okay.
Yeah, no, I don't have anything to add to that response.
Okay, so we're kind of in unknown territory here, right? I mean, we're seeing things happen in Southern California that we don't want to have happen here. Are we clear on that? We agree on that?
I think they're not, it's more of a factual question than but with legal implications.
I'm sorry. Could you pull the microphone in front of you? I can't hear you clearly.
Oh, how is that?
Thank you.
Okay. So when watching what's happening in Southern California, I think it's clear to all of us that HCD seems to be taking a different approach with this housing element cycle than in previous cycles. And so, you know, that's requiring, I think, a lot more analysis and a lot more specificity in our draft housing element than maybe HCD had required previously, and also with a shorter timeline that we had previously understood. So it's kind of putting the city, like other cities in the Bay Area, between kind of a rock and a hard place when it comes to just getting housing element that's substantially compliant with housing element law in front of HCD. So in that sense, we're in a challenging situation, I'll say.
Right, but one could say we have the advantage of seeing what's happening to the others that have gone before us. So anyway, that's a statement, not a question.
Okay.
Thanks. So do we think that we can certify our own housing element in a way that's satisfactory to HCD within the timeline they're giving us, which is January 31st, I guess, end of business? Do we think we can do that? I mean, when I spoke with you earlier with the city manager last week, what I suggested was that we, you know, seeing as how we seem to be under the gun to do a lot of stuff, that I guess maybe we didn't realize we had to do before, but now we know we do. Are we going to divert lots of resources to getting that done? Is that what's going on?
Our goal is to, we've got a timeline to have a housing element before you for adoption before January 31st, and that is what we intend to do.
But will we have submitted it to HCD by then?
That is the goal as well, to have resubmitted our housing element to HCD, our draft housing element to HCD, with a response to each of their comments. And then concurrently with that submittal, we'll then be bringing it forward to Planning Commission and ultimately Council for consideration for adoption.
Okay, because from what I understand, there's going to be some serious reconsideration of, in the sites inventory, some of the sites that I think are questionable whether there will actually be the owners of some of the larger properties seeking a change of land use to the extent that, well, let me just talk about, for instance, the Hillsdale Shopping Center. The north 12 acres already developed, and yet it seems as though our inventory takes into consideration the full 60 acres. And it describes that as a site where it would be built out to the max with all housing, which I have no idea what may end up eventually at some point being there, but I'm pretty sure that's all housing is not really what the owner of that property is looking at, since they're basically a commercial developer and housing is a little different for them. What do you have to say about that?
I think the key there is to note that we're looking at the density that could be realized from that full site. You do not need the full site to build a development buildings that have units to that density. And so with any of these sites, you don't need the full site to realize the maximum density. And I think that's the key, especially for the larger sites, where if you're looking at 50 units an acre, and if with Hillsdale you've got around 40 acres, you don't need 40 acres to realize that level of density. And so I think that's the key with a lot of these sites where you have a parking lot, where maybe you have an underutilized portion, you can maintain the portion that has been recently rebuilt, that's active, that they do not want to remove, and still realize that maximum density. And so I think that's the key factor with a lot of these sites, in particular the larger ones.
But is HCD asking that we base our what we state as the buildable density on any site of any particular different type of use on a conversation that we've had with the property owners, those in control?
With their comment, say, we had looked at many sites as developing at 100% of the maximum density. In that case, we're using a number of pieces of information to justify why we made that assumption. Not every site in the inventory we're estimating there, but many we are. And that's because of the development trends we've observed. Because we, as under Measure Y, have a limit of 50 units an acre, which many jurisdictions of our equivalent size have higher. And so we've discussed with developers where they would want to maximize density and then utilize density bonus on top of it. So many of the projects actually exceed 100%. So that's also important to keep in mind with our sites inventory. We're not giving ourselves credit for any density bonus units, but when you look at just about every recent project in the city, they've utilized density bonus. So you could still say at even 100%, those could be considered conservative estimates.
Right. Okay. Yes. Did I hear?
No,
Oh, no.
I'm sorry.
Okay. Okay, I think those are my questions for right now. I think we need to go to public comment. Madam Clerk, how many, do we have one more question?
So I just wanted to get back to the question about an affordable housing overlay as a policy objective or a policy that I'm not seeing in our housing element. So is it there and I'm not seeing it?
If there's council direction to be more explicit, we could look at how we can fold that into our policies. We do look at that outside of the housing element in certain ways in the land use element, but if there's direction to incorporate that as a policy or program within our housing element, we can definitely look at how we could achieve that.
Okay. So let me ask this one again a little differently. Are there specific policies in the housing element that you feel sort of in a roundabout way or in any way create an affordable housing overlay?
I think we need to understand when you say affordable housing overlay, what you're looking to accomplish, because right now we have the city's inclusionary ordinance, which requires a percentage of affordable units with projects over a certain size. So I guess we would need to understand when you say affordable housing overlay, what is looking to be accomplished and how would that happen? So I guess we would just need some more information as to the desire there, and then we could look at how that could be folded into the housing element.
So let's take, for example, one of the faith-based community institutions that is not designated as residential, may not be producing more than 10 units to even have the inclusionary clause be applicable, right? So if they had a desire to build 100% affordable housing on their land, they would only be, at least in the situation that I'm aware of, they were restricted to the ADU ordinances and didn't have sufficient density to reap, a meaningful amount of affordable housing units. So, I think that there are examples of community partners, nonprofit organizations, and faith-based community organizations that have explicitly shown interest in wanting to build affordable housing and are constrained by the zoning.
Would you add schools to that list too? They seem to have
Yes.
issues around that. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there could be an overlay. I think with the site that you're referencing, if I'm familiar, there's other constraints that even if there was an overlay, could be challenging to realize that number of units. But we could definitely look at how to best implement one, and we do have.
Yeah, I would almost want to think about other ways to implement something like that. When I think of an overlay district, it applies to an expansive area that has, similar sites and similar site constraints, and is trying to accomplish the same thing in a larger general area. What you're describing to me sounds a little bit more site-specific, and maybe more that it's a policy for the smaller sites, and it could come to realization through an ordinance or some other method other than a zoning overlay, if that's the specific desired outcome.
And that could apply to those specific types of uses without being a broad overlay. Is that what you're saying?
It could be crafted in such a way that it would apply to specific types of sites or types
Okay.
of development.
Okay, thanks.
Well, I would definitely be interested in exploring that and having it be an explicit policy in this document.
Okay. Are we ready to go to public comment now? Thank you. How many speakers do we have present?
At one moment, just a moment, I want to mention that it is 6:40 right now, and we will take a pause at 6:55 p.m. to decide whether we will continue this item on. At this time, I'd like to invite anyone who would like to speak on the housing element item to bring up a speaker slip in person. We will call on in person first, and then anybody on the Zoom call, if you could please raise your hand at this time if you intend to speak on this item. I'll give you a few moments to raise your hands. We will then cut off the list for public comment so that we know how many speakers we have and can make a determination on amount of time. So anybody here in the audience, if you need to speak, please bring me a speaker slip at this time. And anyone on the call who would like to address this item, please raise your hand at this time. Thank you. 10 more seconds. Okay, thank you. At this time, we have one in-person public comment and 4 speakers. The last virtual public comment will be Jordan Grimes.
In that case, we have 3 minutes each. Let's go with that person who is present, please.
How many?
4 speakers virtually and 1 in person.
3 minutes?
3 minutes each? Is that? Okay, 2 minutes each, considering the time.
Okay.
That's good. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, Mr. Kennebrew, please come forward.
Okay, thank you. I'm Ken Abreu. We're a 40-year resident of San Mateo. I'm also a representative of the Sierra Club Sustainable Land Use Committee, which sent you all comments on the housing element. In that letter, we made it clear, and I think you guys all know, that housing is a crisis, a major crisis in this area, and that folks are not able to live here that need to live here. Essential workers, whether they're working for the city or they're school teachers or they're nurses. We have to solve that problem. As the staff pointed out in their housing element, it's a regional problem. It's not a problem you can solve by yourself. It has to be done on a regional basis. So when the staff asks on this question whether you should enthusiastically go after meeting these requirements put out by HCD, the answer needs to be an emphatic yes. The only way this crisis can be dealt with is on a regional basis. The only way that the regional problem can be solved if the components, which are cities and counties, work with the state in a diligent manner to solve it. Zach has said that this is going to require significant resources and major commitment. Of course it will. This is a huge problem that's going on for a long time. It cannot be solved in a simple, laid-back way. It's going to require a major commitment of resources. It's going to require, a major commitment in policy to address the problem and to do our parts. We are a city within this region. This region has a huge problem of homelessness, of unaffordability, and we ask you to move ahead and work with the state in a positive way to get this done. And yes, it's going to take a lot of work, but the problem is one that requires that. Thank you very much.
Thank you. The next speaker is Jeremy Levine.
Good evening, everyone. Good to see you all here tonight. Great to be back in person. I had a bunch of things I wanted to say tonight, and I don't know. I mean, it doesn't seem like this council is moving in a direction of really trying to make substantial changes, and so I don't want to fight a hopeless fight. I want to talk abstractly about, like, when this housing element comes back, what the things are that you can really do to get it over the finish line from HCD's perspective. It's about programs. Staff can provide analysis, they can justify things, but at the end of the day, I'm just not totally convinced all of the things that maybe HCD asks to analyze, like that's all HCD wants is more analysis, because maybe you provide the analysis and it's still not enough from HCD's perspective. And you can say, well, we'll adopt and who cares, but there are like state grants tied to HCD certification. A court can't compel them. Like if you don't get HCD certification, you lose those grants. And I mean, yeah, lawsuits, cities can still be sued, and it doesn't necessarily sound like the city is fully aware of all of the lawsuits that are already happening in Southern California. I referenced one of them in the letter that I sent earlier today. I don't know, I'm just kind of rambling because I think that you're the legislators, and only you can help the city get on track with its policies and programs, like the actual things the city is going to do. I think the affordable housing ordinance that Amaranth Lee was mentioning was really good, but yeah, it's just a start. Anyway, thank you, and I hope you all have a good rest of the evening.
Thank you. The next speaker is Carol Eldridge.
Good evening, Mayor Bonilla and members of council. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Good. Okay. My name is Carol Eldridge, and I'm speaking this evening as a member of One San Mateo, of which I am vice chair. When One San Mateo submitted its earlier comment letter about the housing element, I think it was back in May, our special focus was on issues related to affirmatively furthering fair housing. In particular, we noted the failure of the initial draft to adequately study affluent neighborhoods with high concentrations of white residents. It omitted analysis of the history and underlying conditions of these neighborhoods, and in so doing, it failed to bring to light the impact of non-dense housing, both on racial segregation and on our ever-worsening affordability and displacement problems. As a result, the housing element also failed to propose policies and programs that will change these conditions. A clear requirement for the new revision is to address this history and these conditions in a candid manner, then to identify remedial measures that will help to transform presently exclusive neighborhoods into inclusive ones, including, we would maintain, by upzoning. On a related note, we saw that there was an absence of affordable housing sites in any of the highest opportunity areas. Tonight, One San Mateo joins with Councilmember Lee in encouraging that the housing element make inroads on this by facilitating affordable housing, either through an overlay or a policy such as been discussed. Also, to ease the burden of creating this affordable housing, we urge a policy reducing fees on affordable housing, especially impact and part fees. And for low and very low income units, we urge waiving the fees altogether. One San Mateo, along with its allies, identified a list of policies that we encourage become a priority as the housing element revision is prepared. I've named a few of these, and I believe others are summarized in the email written by HLC. The interest of all of us is to see San Mateo succeed in meeting its obligations and in setting a course that more equitably distributes opportunity among all of those who live in San Mateo. Thank you.
Thank you. The next speaker is Mitch Spiegel. Mitch, please.
Hi, I'm here. Hi, Council. Again, thank you for all the work that you guys are doing on this. I know you guys are definitely really diving into this, and I appreciate the consultants, everyone who's putting their time in. I wanted to make a brief comment about the implementation versus the full acceptance piece. I think that's huge. That was brought up today. I think it's particularly important because, as many of us can see, the industry climate has changed in this area. Places like Meta and other companies are stopping and even laying off workers. And I think it's important to understand that the climate that we saw the last 2-3 years that influenced these numbers may not be the same climate in housing to job ratio that we see the next 5, 6, 7, 8 years. So I would urge the council to look at that and to think about that when we're talking about implementing, to kind of get through this, the builder's remedy piece of it versus, actually getting a fully accepted, underwritten housing element. So the second piece I wanted to talk about was if there's anything in the provisions that we can put in there about selection of sites. I personally worry that with Project Room Key and Project Home Key funding that we may lose some sites that would be just perfect for great low income, affordable housing near transit because of some of these state dollars. So I would just ask council to also look into that to see if there's anything we can do to make sure that the sites in San Mateo that are the best to meet our goals and the affordable housing requirement, that we can keep our claim to those, right? The motels and little things like that that are being kind of scooped up, that we kind of have first dibs on that for our own housing element and getting the affordable housing that our citizens need. Thank you, appreciate it.
Thank you. And our last speaker is Jordan Grimes.
Good evening, Council, Honorable Mayor. I'm honestly somewhat at a loss as to where to begin. It would frankly be impossible to address the myriad issues with the staff report in response to HCD's comment letter in just 2 minutes. It is problematic to the point where I frankly believe staff needs to start over. To backtrack a bit, it needs to be understood that the letter we received from HCD was nothing short of scathing, appropriately so, and has been recognized as such by other jurisdictions across the region. One of Atherton's planning consultants referred to it recently as sobering. That's absolutely correct. As local advocates contended after the draft was released, it was strikingly deficient relative to state requirements in just about every conceivable way. Virtually every point brought up by advocates was also brought up by HCD. On the topic of tonight's staff report and response matrix, they present, I am sorry to say, nothing short of a complete detachment from reality. They do nothing to meaningfully address HCD's comments in any way, instead proposing we self-certify, opening us to litigation risk. The matrix largely ignores HCD's guidance, and where it does acknowledge it, it proposes few changes, certainly none, which will meaningfully satisfy the statutory requirements they must meet. We are hurtling towards decertification. On Measure Y specifically, telling HCD about the general plan update is not nearly enough. I don't know how that's not clear. HCD is not going to wait for the general plan process to play out. The housing element process is now. We don't get to relieve ourselves of state obligations by saying, this will happen later, we pinky swear. HCD requires concrete analysis of constraints and amelioration of such. We either do that now or we don't get certified. If we proceed on this path, there will be litigation. Whether it's from Carla, YIMBY Law, Californians from Homeownership, or the Attorney General's office itself. That is going to be the end result if we move forward. It does not have to be like this. Other cities have gotten certified on their first try. All the cities in question did this not through magic, but by simply following state guidance, putting together a sites inventory focused on realistic capacity, thoroughly analyzing fair housing concerns and constraints, and then taking concrete steps to address them. We are capable of this as well. Thank you.
Thank you. There are no more speakers, and if I could bring the council's attention, it is 6:53 p.m., a time for direction on what you'd like to do.
Okay, so let me ask the council, do we think we need more than 7 minutes to make our comments? Yes.
I think we need more than 7 minutes.
Yes, I'm seeing nods. So I believe that we will need to come back to finish this after the regular meeting. So,
Can I ask a question before we adjourn? Do you mind? Because maybe I could just use the time. Can you explain to me, Measure Y would have to be overturned by the voters, right? So the last speaker just talked about you can't just tell HCD you're going to do something about it. So how do we resolve that conflict? Because it's confusing in my mind.
What the recommended direction in the matrix was, HCD is asking for us to identify the constraints and then take steps to do outreach and mitigate the effects of Measure Y over the housing cycle. The general plan update is taking place at the front end of the housing cycle. So what we're recommending is that we identify exactly what we're doing with our general plan update process and how it is meeting the intent of what HCD is looking for. So while it's not specifically in the housing element itself, it is absolutely part of it, as the housing element is part of our overall general plan. And we would be moving forward with outreach and possible paths forward with how to look at Measure Y at the front end of our housing cycle.
But it would have to be brought to the voters, correct?
That is correct. Any modification to Measure Y would require voter approval.
Okay, so to say we want to do something about it in the future must include that that is subject to the voters' decision. In other words, it makes it very difficult for us that there's something on the books that has to be overturned by the voters. And that may not satisfy HCD, but that's the quandary we're in. Fair to say?
That would be accurate, yes.
Okay.
I think that's why HCD described it as a barrier to development.
Yeah, but how do you deal with that barrier
Right.
is my point.
Exactly.
Okay, thank you, sir. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. In that case, then I think we'll be adjourning for now and reconvening with the regular meeting at 7 p.m., which it looks like it's in just 4 minutes. Thank you. Adjourn.
Mr. Mayor, it might be 7:05 by the time we flip the meeting.
7:05, we will convene with the regular meeting. Thank you.